In 1874, a group of businessmen in Charlotte, North Carolina, pooled $50,000 and opened a bank. The city had 7,000 people. No port, no navigable river, no university of note, no state capital, no strategic military value. George Washington had passed through several decades after the Revolution and written in his diary that it was a trifling place. And yet that $50,000 bank, Commercial National on Tryon Street, is, through a chain of mergers, name changes, and acquisitions so aggressive they startled Wall Street, the direct ancestor of Bank of America, the second largest financial institution in the United States. Charlotte today holds more bank assets than any city in the country except New York. It is, by any rational measure, the most improbable banking capital on earth. And the thing is, if you understand how that happened, really understand it, you have to start not with banking at all, but with a rock. A 17-pound rock pulled out of a creek in 1799 by a 12-year-old boy named Conrad Reed on his family's farm in Cabarrus County, about 25 miles east of Charlotte. The boy brought the rock home. It was yellow and dense and interesting looking. Nobody knew what it was. His family used it as a doorstop. For 3 years, a 17-pound gold nugget sat propping open a door in a North Carolina farmhouse. Then, in 1802, a jeweler examined it and told the Reed family what they had. He offered them $3.50, and they took it. The nugget was worth something north of $3,600 in 1802 money. That was the beginning of the first gold rush in the United States of America. Not California, not Colorado, North Carolina. By 1804, word had spread that a 28-pound piece of gold had been found near the Reed farm, and prospectors started arriving. By the 1820s, miners had fanned out across the Piedmont counties surrounding Charlotte, scratching gold from hundreds of veins and creek beds. At one point, more than 600 mines were operating in Mecklenburg County alone, including the Rudisill mine near downtown Charlotte. A German metalsmith named Christopher Bechtler set up a private mint in Rutherford County in 1830, pressing raw gold into coins for a fee, because there was simply no other practical way to spend the stuff. By 1830, North Carolina was producing nearly all the domestic gold coined at the Philadelphia Mint. The problem was getting it there. The road from Charlotte to Philadelphia took weeks. It was expensive, and it was crawling with bandits. Miners lost gold, patience, and sometimes their lives. In 1831, North Carolina merchants and miners petitioned Congress for a branch mint closer to the source. They received no response for 3 years. Then the U.S. Treasury began investigating Bechtler's private coining operations and realized that North Carolina genuinely needed a federal presence. In 1835, Congress appropriated $50,000 for a branch mint in Charlotte, the first branch mint in the nation's history. Construction began on West Trade Street. The building was designed by William Strickland in the Federal style, a 2-story brick structure with dressed stone in the basement. It opened on July 27, 1837. The Charlotte Mint struck only gold, no silver, no copper. Its first coin was a $5 half-eagle stamped on March 28, 1838, with a small C beneath the eagle to mark its origin. Over the next 23 years, the mint processed more than $5 million in gold currency, ones, 2 quarter eagles, $5 half-eagles. To this day, Charlotte Mint coins are among the most sought after in American numismatics, some commanding upward of $20,000 at auction. But here is what matters about the mint for this story. It did not make Charlotte rich. It made Charlotte relevant. For the first time, the federal government had planted a permanent institution in this inland crossroads. Charlotte was now, in the eyes of Washington, a place where money was made, literally coined. That identity, once fixed, never left. There is a specific spot in Charlotte where you can stand and feel the whole city radiating outward from under your feet. It is the intersection of Trade and Tryon Streets, known today as Independence Square. Trade Street runs roughly east-west, following an old path where the Catawba and other tribes traded goods for centuries. Tryon Street runs at a diagonal, not along a compass line, but along a natural ridge line, the nation's path, the ancient route stretching from Georgia to the Chesapeake. When surveyors laid out Charlotte's grid in 1770, they followed these two paths. Walk toward Independence Square from any direction, and you will walk uphill, gently but definitely. This is why Charlotte calls its downtown uptown. It is not marketing, it is geography. And under that intersection, in the rock and red clay of the Piedmont, there is still gold. Old mine shafts riddle the ground beneath uptown Charlotte. The city is literally built on gold. But gold alone does not make a city. What makes a city is connections, and Charlotte's transformation from a courthouse village into something bigger began with iron rails. In 1852, local investors in Charlotte and upstate South Carolina completed the Charlotte and South Carolina Railroad, the first rail line to penetrate the heart of the Carolinas. It connected Charlotte to Columbia, and from there to the port of Charleston. For the first time in its history, Charlotte had easy access to the sea. The North Carolina legislature immediately authorized a second line, linking Charlotte to Raleigh, and by 1855, a line reached Norfolk, Virginia. Charlotte was suddenly a railroad crossroads, and a crossroads in the 1850s meant cotton. Annual cotton sales in the city jumped from less than 3,000 bales in 1855 to 12,000 by 1860. The population, which had been just 1,065 in 1850, more than doubled to 2,265. When the Civil War came, Charlotte's rail connections made it a strategic hub. The Confederacy operated a naval yard, a gun factory, and a military hospital in the city. The Mint on West Trade Street was seized by Confederate forces in May 1861, a month before North Carolina formally seceded. They used it briefly to stamp coins with confiscated gold, then converted it into a headquarters and hospital. When Jefferson Davis fled Richmond in April 1865, he stopped in Charlotte, holding the last full meeting of the Confederate cabinet in a house on North Tryon Street. The war ended days later. The rails to Columbia had been cut during the fighting, but they were quickly restored. African Americans, who comprised 40% of Mecklenburg County's population, were now free. Charlotte's population doubled again during the 1860s, reaching 4,473 by 1870. In the 1870s, the city added more rail connections, including a line stretching from Richmond to Atlanta that passed through uptown. Charlotte was now tied firmly to the national economy, rising and falling with its rhythms. And it was the city's railroad men, cotton brokers, and post-war boosters who began talking most loudly about a phrase that would define Charlotte for the next half-century. What happened next is what set Charlotte apart from 100 other southern towns that had railroads and cotton. Charlotte rebuilt fast, and it rebuilt with a specific idea. The idea was called the New South, and while the phrase was used all over the post-war region, Charlotte's leaders took it more literally than most. They did not merely want to recover. They wanted to industrialize. The logic was simple and ruthless. For generations, the South had grown raw cotton and shipped it north to be manufactured into fabric by New England mills. The profit was in the manufacturing. Why not keep it? In 1880, a man named Robert M. Oates, who had come to Charlotte in 1853 as a grocery store clerk and built himself into a cotton broker, and who had served as a brigade quartermaster during the war, learning logistics the hard way, reunited with his three nephews and opened the Charlotte Cotton Mill beside the Atlantic, Tennessee, and Ohio railroad tracks on Graham Street. It was the first cotton mill built within the city limits. A modest one-story brick building with two 75-horsepower boilers, a 127-horsepower engine, and tenement houses for its workers. The Charlotte Daily Observer predicted it would add much to Charlotte's material prosperity and would be the means of bringing similar enterprises into operation. 2 years later, a man arrived who would prove the observer right beyond anyone's imagination. Daniel Augustus Tompkins was born on a plantation in Edgefield, South Carolina, studied engineering at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York, worked at Bethlehem Iron Works in Pennsylvania, and came to Charlotte in 1883 as the Southern sales representative for the Westinghouse Machine Company. He was 31 years old, tireless, opinionated, and possessed by a single conviction: the South should stop shipping raw cotton north and start manufacturing it into finished goods at home. He struck off on his own and founded the D.A. Tompkins Company, which designed, financed, and built cotton mills across the Piedmont. Among his first projects in Charlotte were the Alpha, Ada, and Victor mills in 1888 and 1889, the city's second, third, and fourth mills. By 1897, Charlotte's cotton mills totaled 75,000 spindles, consumed more than 20,000 bales of cotton annually, and employed nearly 1,400 workers. Their weekly pay for a 55-hour work week averaged $5. By 1910, Tompkins's firm had developed 250 cottonseed oil mills, 150 electric plants, and 100 cotton plants. He bought the Charlotte Observer to promote industrialization, wrote textbooks on mill design that became scripture for a generation of factory owners, and helped establish the textile school at what became North Carolina State University. He died in 1914, having personally done more than perhaps any single man to shift the center of American textile manufacturing from New England to the Carolina Piedmont. Charlotte's population reflected the change. In 1890, it stood at 11,557, respectable but still smaller than Columbia, Raleigh, Charleston, and Wilmington. By 1895, the rechristened Charlotte Cotton Mill had expanded to 9,000 spindles and added 208 looms to make sheets. At least 8 other cotton mills had opened in the city. By 1897, Charlotte's cotton mills totaled 75,000 spindles, consumed more than 20,000 bales of cotton annually, and employed nearly 1,400 workers. Their weekly pay for a 55-hour work week averaged $5. By 1906, 1/4 of all the textile mills in the United States were located in North Carolina, most of them in the Piedmont, and Charlotte was the Piedmont's commercial hub. By 1910, the city had tripled to 34,014 people, surpassing Wilmington to become North Carolina's largest city. It has never relinquished that title. During World War I, the federal government established Camp Green north of the city, bringing 40,000 soldiers and their suppliers, many of whom stayed after the armistice. By 1930, the population had reached 82,675. Charlotte briefly lost its top spot to Winston-Salem in the 1920 census. Winston-Salem had 2,000 more people, but passed it again by 1930 and never looked back. The mills, the railroads, the cotton trade, the wholesale distribution network, they all needed something: banking services. And here is where a peculiarity of North Carolina law becomes, in retrospect, one of the most consequential regulatory details in American economic history. Most states by the early 20th century restricted or outright prohibited branch banking. The goal was to protect small-town banks from being swallowed by big city institutions. In Texas, a bank could have one office and one office only. In Illinois, same thing. In New York, banks could branch within their home city, but not beyond it. By 1923, 28 states either banned branch banking or had no branches at all. As late as 1978, 10 states still allowed no branching whatsoever, and 35 placed major restrictions on the practice. But North Carolina never passed any such law. It was, remarkably, the last of the original 13 states to even charter a private bank, only doing so in 1804. And within a decade of that late start, the legislature permitted statewide branching. The reason was structural. There was no single dominant city in North Carolina to fear. No one metropolis, no Chicago, no San Francisco threatened to gobble up the countryside. Without a boogeyman, there was no political will to restrict growth. So banks in North Carolina were free to open branches across the state in any town that would have them. The consequence, playing out over decades, was profound but invisible. North Carolina banks grew larger, accumulated more capital, and developed skills in acquisition and management of far-flung operations that their counterparts in restricted states simply never needed. They learned how to absorb other banks. They learned how to integrate back offices, retrain staff, consolidate ledgers. They got good at getting bigger. By 1927, when the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond opened a branch in Charlotte, choosing the city because of its central location in the Carolinas and the density of textile and distribution businesses there, the groundwork for something extraordinary was already being laid, even if no one could have described what it would become. The 1950s are when the story accelerates. Charlotte's banks began buying each other. The rivalry was driven partly by ambition and partly by the desire to compete with Winston-Salem's Wachovia, then the largest bank in the state. In 1957, American Trust Company on Tryon Street merged with Commercial National Bank, the same bank founded with $50,000 back in 1874, to form American Commercial Bank, making it the second largest in the state after Wachovia. Its president was Addison Reese. 3 years later, in 1960, American Commercial merged with Greensboro-based Security National Bank and became North Carolina National Bank, NCNB. It had assets of about $500 million. Simultaneously, another Charlotte bank was on the move. In 1958, Union National Bank, which had started in 1908 with its first branch as nothing more than a large roll-top desk set in the lobby of the Buford Hotel on West Tryon Street, acquired the First National Bank of Asheville and renamed itself First Union National Bank. Charlotte now had two aggressive, growth-minded banks, and they were about to go to war, not with each other, but with the rest of the country. In 1959, a 24-year-old ex-Marine named Hugh Leon McCall, Jr. walked into American Commercial Bank in Charlotte looking for a job. He had just been discharged after a 2-year tour as a troop leader, had a business degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and had come home to Bennettsville, South Carolina, expecting to join his family's cotton brokerage and ginning businesses. His father had a different idea. The McCall family had banking in its blood the way some families have farming or law. Hugh's great-grandfather, Duncan Donald McCall, had built the first railroad and the first cotton mills in Marlborough County, and in 1886 founded the Bank of Marlborough. His grandfather ran the bank after that. His father took over as president at 25, then liquidated it during the Depression. But he paid off every single depositor, every penny. It was the kind of act that defined a family. After the bank closed, McCall's father turned to cotton farming and eventually bought a controlling interest in a small trust company. Hugh went to work part-time at 14, learning to keep books and make deposits, driving across North and South Carolina for the family business. When the younger McCall came home from the Marines, his father told him he didn't have the brains for farming and steered into Charlotte, where the McCall family had done business for years. Hugh McCall was hired as a management trainee at American Commercial Bank. One of the first things McCall did at the bank was pick up the annual report of Bank of America, then headquartered in San Francisco, and then the largest bank in the country. He read it and realized something that lodged in him like a bullet. Bank of America had grown more in a single year than the total value of his entire company. The banks of the South, all of them, were small and hemmed in by laws that prevented them from crossing state lines. Northern and California banks handled the big corporate accounts, even for Southern businesses. McCall decided then and there that he was going to change that. He would build a bank that could compete with anyone. Decades later, a University of North Carolina banking professor would call what followed the most significant banking story of the late 20th century. McCall rose fast. Vice President, then President of NCNB in 1974 at 39, then Chairman and CEO in 1983. When he took over, NCNB had $12 billion in assets, $8 billion in deposits, and 172 offices, all in North Carolina. It was a respectable regional bank. McCall did not want a respectable regional bank. He wanted a national powerhouse, and he was willing to break things to get it. His first move exploited a loophole. NCNB owned a small trust company in Florida, not technically a bank, so not subject to interstate banking prohibitions. In 1982, McCall used that trust company as a foothold to purchase a small Florida bank, the First National Bank of Lake City. It was the first major out-of-state acquisition. Suddenly, NCNB had branches in 2 states. It was, as a practical matter, one of the first interstate banks in modern American history. McCall's own explanation for the urgency was blunt. He wanted to make Southern banks too rich to be taken over by New York money center banks. The strategy was defense disguised as offense. In 1985, First Union and other North Carolina banks lobbied the state legislature into passing the Southeastern Regional Banking Compact, a law that allowed North Carolina banks to expand into other southern states while forbidding banks from outside the region from entering North Carolina. It was nakedly protectionist. It was also extraordinarily effective. Both NCNB and First Union began spreading across the Southeast, acquiring banks in South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, and Florida. Then came July 1988, and the deal that changed everything. First Republic Bank Corporation of Dallas, Texas, $26 billion in assets, 40 subsidiary banks, had been seized by federal regulators amid the savings and loan crisis. Texas real estate had collapsed. First Republic's loans had gone toxic. The FDIC needed a buyer fast. The bidders included Citicorp and Wells Fargo, the first and 10th largest banks in the country. NCNB, headquartered in a mid-sized southern city most Americans could not find on a map, was not an obvious contender. But McCall had done something no one else thought to do. He had discovered that NCNB's Florida Trust Company, the same entity that had given him his interstate foothold years earlier, technically made NCNB eligible to operate in Texas under existing law. No other out-of-state bank could make that claim. He also won the backing of Dallas billionaire H. Ross Perot, who had been approached by First Republic as a possible investor, but turned them down, lacking banking expertise. When McCall came calling for advice, Perot offered to help raise whatever capital NCNB needed. McCall's team submitted their final bid on a Monday. By Wednesday, they decided they could not wait any longer and flew 220 NCNB employees to Dallas. They checked into a hotel and waited for the phone call that would determine whether their bank and their city had just leapt into the major leagues. On Friday night, FDIC Chairman William Seidman called. In the hotel, there was dead silence as everyone strained to hear what was being said on McCall's end. Then we had 5 seconds to say, "No kidding," one executive remembered. The room erupted. They had won. The deal was staggeringly complex, a 5-year arrangement in which the FDIC provided a cash infusion of $4.2 billion, plus tax breaks estimated at $5.5 billion, and NCNB received an option to buy all of First Republic's shares. A new entity, NCNB Texas National Bank, opened for business the very next morning. In one stroke, NCNB's assets more than doubled, from around $28 billion to more than $60 billion. The bank became the 7th largest in the country, the only top 10 bank outside of New York and California. McCall had quintupled NCNB's assets in 5 years. Texans who took it personally said the acronym stood for No Cash for Nobody. A Fortune profile noted that McCall had once considered adopting as his personal motto, "Crush the sons of bitches and have a nice day." He was unbothered by what Texas thought of him. 1 year before the Texas deal closed, McCall had announced something else. NCNB would build a new headquarters in Charlotte, not a modest office tower, a statement, the tallest building in the Southeast. He hired Cesar Pelli, the Argentine-born architect who would later design the Petronas Towers in Kuala Lumpur. Pelli's design called for a 60-story granite and glass tower rising 871 feet above uptown Charlotte, crowned with a 100-foot structure of silver rods symbolizing the Queen City's crown. The address, 100 North Tryon Street, the intersection of Trade and Tryon. Independence Square, the old crossroads, was less than a block away. The architectural firms that competed for the commission included I.M. Pei of New York. On September 25, 1987, McCall announced that the Pelli design had been selected. Construction required demolishing an entire city block bounded by North Tryon, East Trade, North College, and East 5th Streets. Among the buildings razed were the 1908 Belk Department Store and the 1922 Effords Department Store, landmarks of the Charlotte that McCall's bank was outgrowing. Nobody mourned them publicly. That was Charlotte's way. The future always won. Ground was broken in 1989. The FAA briefly declared the tower a potential hazard to flights at Charlotte Douglas International Airport, threatening to cost the city millions in federal airport grants. But the ruling was eventually overturned. And here is a detail that feels almost too perfect to be true, but it is documented. During excavation, workers found traces of gold in the soil beneath the construction site. The tower was rising from the same earth that had yielded Conrad Reed's nugget, from the same veins that had built the Charlotte Mint, from the gold that had given Charlotte its first identity as a place where money was made. The gold was still there. It had always been there. By November 1990, the tower had reached its 30th floor. On March 20th, 1991, it surpassed the 588-foot One First Union Center, the rival bank's own skyscraper, to become the tallest building in Charlotte and North Carolina. That same year, NCNB merged with the combined CNS/Sovereign Corporation of Atlanta and Norfolk, creating a new entity with $119 billion in assets, 59,000 employees, and 2,000 branches. They called it Nations Bank. The tower was renamed Nations Bank Corporate Center. It opened in 1992, its crown lighting for the first time on the night of May 9th. Charlotte residents called it the Taj McCall. The lobby featured 3 frescoes by North Carolinian artist Ben Long, each measuring 18 by 23 feet, the largest secular frescoes in the United States. The total development cost was approximately $150 million. But McCall was not finished. The tower was a monument, but the monument was not the point. The point was becoming the biggest bank in the country, and there was still one obstacle. Federal law still did not fully permit interstate bank ownership. McCall lobbied relentlessly. He visited, by his own count, more senators and congressmen than he could shake a stick at. Then, after a campaign stop in Albany, Georgia, he met with Bill Clinton and talked until 3 in the morning. "I got him on my side," McCall said later. In 1994, Congress passed the Regal-Neal Interstate Banking and Branching Efficiency Act, finally allowing banks to buy and own other banks across state lines. This was McCall's checkmate. In 1997, Nations Bank acquired Barnett Bank of Jacksonville, Florida, at $15.5 billion, the largest bank in the state, pushing total assets to $284 billion. Then, in September 1998, Nations Bank completed a $66.6 billion merger with Bank America Corporation of San Francisco, the very bank whose annual report had stunned McCall as a young trainee nearly 4 decades earlier. The combined institution took the name Bank of America. McCall later said that if he could do it over, he would have kept the Nations Bank name. But Bank of America had brand recognition coast to coast, and McCall was a practical man. It was the first coast-to-coast bank in the nation's history, operating in all 50 states, and it would be headquartered not in San Francisco, not in New York, but in Charlotte, North Carolina. Population at the time, roughly 540,000. The San Francisco Chronicle noted the irony with obvious discomfort. Charlotte, a city whose entire history Bank America's leadership could not have recited, was swallowing a California titan. The headquarters remained in the tower at 100 North Tryon Street on the ridge above the Gold. When McCall retired in 2001, the bank he had started with at $12 billion in assets held more than $642 billion, with 5,000 banking centers across 22 states and 180,000 employees. He had overseen more than 50 acquisitions. A journalist later described it as a cartoonish arms race of bank acquisitions that would ultimately turn the American business world upside down. Charlotte, the trifling place, now controlled more bank assets than any city in America except New York. But Charlotte's banking story was not only NCNB, it was also First Union, and the First Union story ends very differently. First Union had followed a parallel path of aggressive expansion through the 1980s and 1990s, acquiring banks across the Southeast and beyond, eventually growing into one of the nation's largest financial institutions. The two Charlotte banks, Nations Bank and First Union, were fierce crosstown rivals, each racing to outgrow the other, their competing skyscrapers rising on Tryon Street like dueling monuments to ambition. When Nations Bank's tower surpassed First Union's in 1991, the symbolism was not lost on anyone. In 2001, First Union acquired the old Wachovia National Bank of Winston-Salem, a venerable institution founded in 1879 with $100,000 in capital, and took its name. It was a calculated decision. The Wachovia brand carried more trust and warmth in the Southeast than the First Union name, which had developed a reputation for rough post-merger integrations and customer complaints. Charlotte-based Wachovia, as the combined bank was now called, became the fourth largest banking company in the country, with assets over $800 billion and 3,300 financial centers in 21 states. Charlotte had two of the biggest banks in America headquartered within blocks of each other on Tryon Street. It seemed like a fairy tale. Then came 2006. Wachovia's leadership under CEO Ken Thompson acquired Golden West Financial Corporation of Oakland, California for $24 billion. Golden West was the nation's second-largest savings and loan, and its signature product was the Pick-a-Pay mortgage, an option-adjustable rate loan that allowed borrowers to make payments so low they did not even cover the interest owed. The unpaid interest was simply added to the loan balance. It was, in essence, a bet that housing prices would rise forever. Wachovia bought Golden West at the absolute peak of the American housing bubble. When the bubble burst, Wachovia's losses were catastrophic. In the second quarter of 2008 alone, the bank reported a loss of $9.1 billion, including a $6.1 billion goodwill impairment charge, the vast majority of it traceable to Golden West. The stock price cratered. Depositors began pulling money. By September 2008, the federal government was expressing concern about Wachovia's liquidity. When Congress rejected the initial Treasury bailout plan on September 25th, and regulators seized Washington Mutual the same day, Wachovia's crisis became existential. Citigroup initially offered to buy the bank with FDIC assistance. Then, on October 3rd, Wells Fargo of San Francisco made a competing offer, $15 billion, no government assistance needed. Wachovia accepted. On December 31st, 2008, it was over. Charlotte had lost a corporate headquarters. Wachovia, the name that went all the way back to 1879, to a $100,000 bank in Winston-Salem, was gone. In 2011, workers came to unbolt the blue and green Wachovia signs and replaced them with the red Wells Fargo stagecoach. A 16-year veteran who had personally overseen the design of that logo watched the last one come down and said it was bittersweet. But Charlotte, characteristically, moved forward. Wells Fargo kept the city as its East Coast headquarters and eventually employed roughly the same number of people Wachovia had. The blow was real, but not mortal. In 2019, something happened that would have seemed absurd even a decade earlier. BB&T, a Winston-Salem bank that had grown through its own quiet decades of mergers, 59 acquisitions since 1989, combined with SunTrust of Atlanta. The new company needed a headquarters. They chose Charlotte. They called themselves Truist Financial Corporation. Charlotte had gained a corporate headquarters to replace the one it lost. The city, as it had done after every setback, after the gold ran thin, after the Civil War, after the Depression shuttered mills, after the 2008 crisis, had absorbed the blow and come out with more than it started with. Today, Bank of America, the second largest bank in the United States, is headquartered at 100 North Tryon Street in Charlotte. Wells Fargo, the fourth largest, maintains its East Coast headquarters in the city. Truist, the 10th largest, moved its headquarters there. Charlotte holds more banking assets than San Francisco, Chicago, or Los Angeles. It is, by control of assets, second only to New York. Its metropolitan population, which was 142,000 in 1950, is approaching 3 million. The city itself has nearly 1 million residents, with a median age of 34, and is growing faster than 90% of comparably sized American cities. Since 2000, it has added more than 300,000 people. Honeywell moved its corporate headquarters here in 2018. The old cotton mills, the Alpha, the Highland Park, the Johnston, have been converted into food halls, apartments, and shopping centers. The Noda neighborhood, named for North Davidson Street, where the Johnston Mill once ran 12,000 spindles, is now an arts district. The brick frames and arched windows that D.A. Tompkins designed now house yoga studios and craft breweries. And the old Mint, the federal-style brick building on West Trade Street, where gold was coined into half-eagles stamped with a C. That building was slated for demolition in 1933 to make way for a post office expansion. A group of citizens, led by a woman named Mary Myers Dwell, raised money to save it. They bought the building from the U.S. Treasury, had it carefully dismantled brick by brick, and rebuilt it 3 miles east in the Eastover neighborhood on land donated by E.C. Griffith. In 1936, exactly a century after the Mint's original construction began, it reopened as the Mint Museum of Art, North Carolina's first public art museum. It is still there. Inside, among the paintings and pottery and decorative arts, there is a complete collection of every gold coin ever struck at the Charlotte Mint, each one bearing that small C beneath the eagle. Some of those coins have sold at auction for $21,500, 5,300% more than the Reed family got for their 17-pound nugget. The intersection of Trade and Tryon is still there, too. You can stand at Independence Square and look up at the crown of the Bank of America Corporate Center, 871 feet overhead, its silver rods catching the Carolina sun. On a clear day, the tower is visible from 35 miles away. The building rises through 6 setbacks to that glittering crown, visible always from wherever you are in Charlotte. Beneath your feet, the old ridge still rises gently, just as it did when the Catawba walked the nation's path. Beneath the ridge, the old mine shafts still run. A city with no port, no river, no particular geographic reason to exist. A place a passing president once dismissed in a single phrase. Looked down at the gold in its own ground. Looked out at a financial system that had written off the entire South and decided that none of that was going to matter. And then, across 50 years and 50 mergers and one ex-Marine who could not stop acquiring things, it proved itself right. The gold is still there. It has always been there. It is just that now, instead of nuggets, it is denominated in trillions.